But you can sort of see how the shift went away from this norm reference stuff to a listing of word recognition and comprehension skills and other skills, which were then tested and taught towards mastery. This was occurring almost just before the cognitive turn and the advent of psycholinguistics. And right away, I love the challenges that these developments present. Ken Goodman, who is one of the key people in psycholinguistics, based his concept of reading as a psycholinguistic guessing game upon oral reading. But his argument was that one has difficulty judging the oral reading accuracy of students if one is actually looking for exact word replacements. He was able to demonstrate that oftentimes students would substitute meaningful words, syntactically and semantically acceptable words, when they were reading something orally, and argued that one should sort of shift away from an error orientation to looking at a child's oral reading to the concept that these are miscues. And the challenges that presented to people sort of rethinking how they were approaching some of the placement stuff and how they were approaching the pedagogy of and the use of oral reading really was a powerful challenge, not just to the testing of reading using oral reading, but also to our theories and our pedagogy. Likewise, the work in cognition, which highlighted the fact that one would anticipate when one is looking at somebody's reading comprehension, based upon their background knowledge, based upon their own creation of meaning, that there will be differences in the meanings that are generated for the story that are consistent with the person's background knowledge, the purposes they have for reading, their perspectives, and so on. And so coming out of these two things were some really major developments that were challenging the whole concept of reading accuracy, whether it be oral reading or comprehension. And particularly in terms of pedagogy, the work in cognition sort of re-emphasized for those folks who are developing reading materials, you better make sure that you indicate, if you're providing teachers guidance as to whether or not an answer is acceptable, they need to insert answers will vary almost repeatedly, particularly when it came to inferential and interpretive and conclusion types of things, that if one was going to align oneself with what we know about what readers do psycholinguistically and cognitively, one would anticipate that people are creating meanings, that meanings aren't something rather simply translated from the text into the person's head, that the reader is the creator of meaning. And so you can start to sort of see how there begins to get a sort of a conflict between things like the cognitive developments and the psycholinguistics developments and our approaches to reading, certainly in terms of how we measure it. The big thing that I think particularly cognition challenged was a desire by most people to sort of think that reading was a general ability, that what cognition sort of established is, as I showed in the passages for people from across the cross-cultural passages, people will respond to passages quite differently depending upon their personal background of experiences. And that one could actually put together a set of passages, some passages where people will perform very well on, that the person has the background experience to understand them and answer all the questions quite easily, or other passages where students or people might not be able to understand them. And what you might find is people who typically might perform well on this passage might not perform well on this passage. And if you want to actually do a test that better represents the universe of passages, you need to have a mix of those passages. Back in the 70s and 80s, I was on the National Board for National Assessment of Reading, and we were being shown results which revealed exactly what I'm talking about. Passages that kids who normally didn't perform well on performed really better on than those kids who did oftentimes perform better than them. And so you got a sort of a mix of passages, and the reason why these performances, you would speculate as you looked at the passages, it was tied to the relevance of the passages to these particular students. Well, think about that for a moment. That you might find that a person might perform well on this passage, passage 1. On passage 2, let's put him double plus, he might not perform that well. On passage 3, he might perform okay. On passage 4, he might perform really well. And that might be understandable. So another pupil on passage 1 might perform poorly. On passage 2 might perform really, really well because it was relevant. On passage 3 might do okay. On passage 4 might not do so well. And so all of a sudden, as you look at this thing, you're creating a test and you sort of say, wow, I've got this passage which is different for different kids. Now, in your test development approaches, the current one, based upon what they call item response theory, using it in a unidimensional way, it would likely sort of say, well, in terms of overall performance, this passage is a little of an anomaly across different pupils. We want all passages to correlate in the same way, so let's get rid of it. So think about what you've done by doing this. It might like you've got passages which operate the same across different kids to a large extent. But what you're actually doing is you're taking away from an accurate representation of this particular kid's reading to the advantage of this kid. And in a sense, that's where we are oftentimes with test development these days, which I find sort of fairly interesting relative to its sort of disregard for what we know in terms of cognition and the extent to which, again, testing and in this case, the development of tests overrides some of even the theoretical developments which would suggest that the test development proceed in a different sort of way. Well, let me move from this to talk a little bit about the next major development in our field, the social turn and the socio-political turn associated with the critical turn, and look to see how this played out relative to test development in our field.